Hi, everyone. So today we're going to be looking at some worries or problems that people have raised about the principle of universalizability and whether it's a good test of morality. So in this video, we'll just briefly review the argument for the irrationality of immorality that Kant tries to give by appealing to the principle of universalizability. Then we're going to introduce the problem of fanatic cases. Then we'll talk a little bit about Kant on the notion of an absolute duty. So I want to start by considering an argument we ended with last time, the argument for the irrationality of immorality. It says, if you're rational, then you're consistent. If you're consistent, then you obey the principle of universalizability. If you obey the principle of universalizability, then you act morally. Therefore, if you're rational, then you act morally. Therefore, if you act immorally, then you're irrational. Notice, what that says is when you disobey moral commands, moral imperatives, you are thereby acting irrationally. But notice the mere fact that you are acting irrationally doesn't thereby prove that you're acting immorally, because there are ways to act irrationally that have nothing to do with morality or immorality. Right, so I just wanted to sort of clarify, not everybody who is irrational is thereby immoral. The claim is just everybody who's immoral is thereby acting irrationally, is what that conclusion says. All right, now, in order to assess that argument, though, we need to consider whether or not the principle of universalizability really is a good test of morality, like the argument said in the third premise. Well, here's a problem. The goals of fanatics are ones that can often be met in a world in which everyone shares their aims. Fanatics need not make exceptions of themselves. So a fanatic is like a sports fanatic where they're just sort of committed to this sort of one sort of idea or activity over everything else. They're sort of devoted to it, sort of with sort of their sort of full sort of heart. So fanatics, when they're devoted to some sort of cause or goal, they might be devoted to it at the expense of everything else. But those fanatics, they need not make any exception of themselves. The murderous aims of any number of groups could easily be achieved in a world in which everyone supported them. Thus, fanatics can be consistent in the relevant sense. Their guiding principles could be fulfilled if everyone else were to adopt them. So, the author of our textbook says, I think this shows that the principle of universalizability fails to give us an adequate test of fairness, for we can follow its advice while still singling out individuals or groups for discriminatory treatment. There can be consistent Nazis after all. It doesn't follow that their policies are fair or morally acceptable. So the idea here is, imagine a world. So take the Nazi that is sort of a fanatic. They're committed to this cause at the expense of everything else. So much so that they would be willing to apply those sort of principles to themselves. They'd walk themselves to the gas chamber if they found out they had Jewish ancestry. Well, imagine those kinds of principles. Now imagine that everybody were to support and act on those maxims. Well, you know what? That wouldn't undermine the Nazis' goals. In fact, that'd probably make it a lot easier for the Nazis to achieve their goals. And so it looks like they are able to consistently apply their principles to sort of everyone else. They can universalize them. Nonetheless, it seems like those principles are just really bad principles. And so it looks like the fact that someone can apply their principles sort of universally to everyone without undermining their own goals doesn't necessarily show that the maxim is a good one, a fair one, or a moral one. And so it seems as if universalizability is not sufficient for morality. All right. A loosely related issue here in Kant concerns his views on absolute moral rules. An absolute moral rule is a true moral rule that it would always be morally wrong to break, no matter the situation. So it's a true moral rule that has no exceptions. It would apply in every situation, no matter what. All right, now, are there any absolute moral rules? Well, Kant believed that there are moral rules, such as he thought the rule that sort of goes against, that says you can't lie or kill, he thought those moral rules were absolute. He thought they were always wrong to break no matter the situation. However, advocating for those kinds of absolute rules regarding specific actions seems to lead to some counterintuitive results. So consider this example from the book. In a much discussed case, that of the inquiring murderer, Kant has us imagine a man bent on killing. This man knocks at your door and asks if you know the location of his intended victim. You do. Should you reveal it? If you do, your information is almost certainly going to lead to murder. Now, Kant thought you had two decent choices. Ideally, you'd just say nothing. That wouldn't help the murderer and it wouldn't involve lying on your part. But what if you had to say something? In that case, according to Kant, you have to tell the truth because you must never lie under any circumstances. He thought it was an absolute moral rule. So even in that situation, you'd have to tell the truth. But the worry here is that just doesn't seem right in this scenario. It seems as if this is a really bad situation and you ought to be able to make the best of it. We want our morality to be flexible so as to allow us to respond to those kinds of details. Most people think that in that situation, it would be okay to lie. And so this idea that there are specific kinds of actions that are absolutely wrong strikes many people as unintuitive. In certain cases, breaking certain rules might be the only way that we could avoid disaster. So in this case, the murder of an innocent person. The only way we could escape that disaster is by breaking the rule that tells us not to lie. And shouldn't morality at least allow us to avoid disaster? Similarly, absolute duties, if there are any, would sometimes make it unclear how we can make sense of the purpose of these moral rules. So what's the purpose of a moral rule against killing, for instance? Well, you might think, isn't the purpose of that just to sort of save more lives? The reason we don't want people killing one another is so that more people live. But the rule against killing, if it's absolute, we'd run into the problem that there are situations where following the rule by not killing someone, that would lead to more people being killed as a result. So think of the trolley cases. And I don't just mean like the one with the sort of large person. I mean, even the driver case. In the driver case, you would, or let's see, the bystander case, if you pull the switch, you'd be killing a person in the bystander case. But if you don't pull it, more people would die. And isn't the purpose of that rule against killing meant to sort of save lives? So the worry here is that in these cases, following the rule, the absolute rule against killing or whatever it is, might sometimes seem to actually undermine the very purpose of that rule. Might seem to undermine the very purpose of morality. All right. So if you're going to say that there's absolute rules, it looks like you'd have to say something about what the purpose of morality is if it's not to sort of make the world a better place. All right, so if the principle of universalizability leads to the conclusion that there are these absolute duties against lying and killing, and you think it's intuitive that there aren't absolute duties against these, then that might be a reason to think that it's not the correct test of morality. So let's focus on the case of lying, because I think the case of killing is a little bit more sort of difficult, but most people tend to get behind this idea that, oh, surely there's not an absolute moral rule against lying. And if the principle of universalizability led to that conclusion, that might be problematic. Well, why should we think that the principle of universalizability would lead to the view that there's an absolute rule against lying? Kant thought it did, but yet again, Kant could have been wrong about that. Well, here's a few things. One reason might just be that, look, remember, the principle of universalizability makes the consequences of an action irrelevant to its morality. So the fact that sort of telling the truth in that situation would lead to disaster, well, those consequences do not thereby make the action immoral, because Kant said the consequences are completely irrelevant. What we need to look at is the maxim underlying it. Another reason Kant appealed to, in the case of the murderer, to say that telling the truth would be the right thing is he said there's this idea that we can only hold people morally accountable for what's within their control. And remember, Kant thought that we are in control of the maxims we live by, but we're not in control of the consequences of our actions. oftentimes other people are in control. So when he thought about that murderer at the door example, he said, look, when you tell the truth, you are in control of the maxim of sort of truth telling that is guiding your action. You, though, cannot control what the other person does. And thus, if you tell them the truth and they end up killing them, it is you have no moral responsibility for that death. The moral responsibility lies on the other person who made the choice and was thereby in control of that sort of result. All right, now, that seems a little sort of tricky though, because even though the other person actually did the act and they were sort of in control of it and you can't sort of decide what someone else does, you could still reasonably predict, given that you see this person's intentions, you know sort of about them, maybe they even sort of tell you that they're looking for them so they can kill them. That is, you could reasonably predict that telling the truth would lead to this result. Even if you're not the one doing it, shouldn't you be allowed to sort of prevent that if you can see a way to do so? However, as Schaefer-Landau points out in our textbook, whether lying is wrong depends on the maxim. So even though Kant said that it was wrong to lie in the murder at the door situation, even though Kant thought that there's an absolute moral rule against lying, maybe he was mistaken, since maybe we can think of other maxims that might sort of underlie this action that would be universalizable. So as our author says, Kant just assumed that anyone who lied would be operating with a maxim like this: tell a lie so as to gain some benefit. That maxim is not universalizable. In a world in which everyone did that, no one would trust the words of others, and people would be unable to obtain any of the goals they were trying to achieve by lying. So that might make it look like it would be wrong to lie. But notice, Kant's maxim is not the only one someone could have in that situation. A maxim is a principle that you give yourself. No one can force a principle on you. You choose your maxims. It's up to you to sort of decide what principles you're going to act on. So when confronted with a potential killer, I might adopt this maxim instead. Say whatever I need to in order to prevent the murder of an innocent person. That maxim is universalizable. The goal I'm aiming for, to save an innocent person's life, could be achieved if everyone acted this way. Now, I'm not so sure that Kant's right about this. I'm not so sure that our author of the textbook, Schaefer-Landau, is right about this case. I'm not sure the maxim, say whatever I need to say in order to prevent the murder of an innocent person, is universalizable. Imagine a world where everybody adopts that sort of maxim, that sort of reasoning. Well, if the murderer knows that everybody supports and acts on that reasoning, and they can reasonably tell that you sort of realize they're trying to sort of find this person to kill them, well then when you tell them, when you sort of lie to them, when you say whatever you need to say to try to prevent the murder, they're not going to take your word. They're not going to trust you. If everybody knows that there are situations where people are not going to tell the truth for whatever sort of reason, then if they have reason to suspect that they are in that kind of situation, then they won't be able to trust your word. And so you won't be able to sort of deceive them and take advantage of that. So I'm not sure that even the maxim that Schaefer-Landau has suggested here, it really is universalizable. So I'm not sure that he's going to be able to get Kant out of the worry that it seems to give an unintuitive verdict in the case of the murderer at the door. But again, that depends upon, is that common intuition that it's okay to lie to the murderer at the door correct? Now, most people have that intuition, but maybe there's some things that could be said. I don't know. That's for you to think about. Anyways, next week, so we've seen some of the problems with the principle of universalizability, this worry that leads to absolute duties that strike people as unintuitive, and this worry about sort of fanatic cases. Well, next week, we're going to consider an alternative principle that Kant has proposed as the foundation of morality. Now, Kant thought the principle we look at next week was actually equivalent to the principle of universalizability. He thought it referred to the very same moral law that was picked out by this principle. And on his view, the principle we look at next week says the same thing in different words. However, we're going to consider it as a separate moral principle since it isn't clear that Kant is right that it really says the same thing in different words. And in fact, it looks like it might do a bit better in a number of cases than the principle of universalizability, such as the fanatic case. It seems as if it's not going to lead to the idea that the fanatic is thereby acting morally. All right, so We'll see that next week. Bye bye.